Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's lecture. My name is Nick Pearce, and I'm the director of the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome you here this evening to this lecture, which is to be given by Guy Shrubsole, Guy, who is an activist, a writer, an environmental campaigner, and the author of a recent book, Who Owns England? And Guy's book is about some fundamental questions about our land, about who owns it, about how those patterns of ownership came into being, how they were sustained over many, many centuries, and the consequences of those patterns of land ownership for the way we live today, for how we can deal with climate change, for how we house our population, for how we relate to each other, for patterns of wider social and economic inequalities. So it's a very, very important subject, and one that Guy, in his campaigning work for Friends of the Earth, spends a lot of time working on. But here tonight, he's going to talk about this book in particular, Who Owns Our Land? One that, as I say, exposes a number of things that many of us will not really be familiar with about the land ownership in our country, in our green and pleasant land. Before we start, before I turn to Guy, I've got a few words of housekeeping. Your cameras, for those watching at home, your cameras and microphones are switched off. If you have, and will remain so, if you have a question, put it into the Q&A, and then we'll take lots of questions. When Guy's finished speaking, we'll have a debate, and we'll pick up as many of the questions that you've submitted as we can. The session is being recorded, so filming and photography is taking place, and subject to low technical difficulties, we'll make the session available online as a podcast and as a video as soon as we can. So thanks very much indeed for joining us, and with no further ado, I'll hand over to Guy. Guy.
Thanks very much, Nick. Let me just share my slides with everyone. So yes, thank you very much for inviting me. Good evening to everyone. And I'll be talking tonight about Who Owns England, which is the book that I wrote and came out last year. And it's just been published in paper last year. And particularly about how land impacts upon nature and climate and interacts with some of the most pressing issues that we face as a society today. One of the things that people often ask me when asking about my book is why do you start investigating this obscure question of who owns England? And I think really partly it's down to how frustratingly difficult it is to actually find an answer to that alluringly simple question. So this slide I want to show you, the acreocracy of England, the owners of 3,000 acres culled from Doomsday Book. This is a book that was published in 1873 or thereabouts. And often in talks I give, this is the moment at which I do a bit of audience interaction, which is obviously going to be somewhat more difficult this evening, in which I ask people, who's heard of Doomsday Book? And I think I can probably safely say that almost everyone on this call will have heard of Doomsday Book. But actually what this book here is referring to is not the original Doomsday Book from 1066, or 1086 rather, shortly after the Norman Conquest, when King William, the Conqueror, came over and did his first enumeration of who owned this country and how to tax them all. This is the book it's referring to here is a second Doomsday Book that almost no one seems to have heard of, and it's been airbrushed from history, but was a much more recent account of who owns England, and indeed it was extended to other parts of the British Isles. But it was done in 1873 by, commissioned by the House of Lords as a way to respond to calls for land reform from radicals during the mid-19th century, from the Chartists onwards. And it revealed at the time that England was in fact owned by about half of it was owned by about 4,000 members of the aristocracy and gentry. So this isn't exactly what the House of Lords expected. They hoped to be able to quash the cries from radicals for land reform and to show that actually land was now democratically owned in modern industrial Victorian Britain. But in fact, the opposite was the case. They confirmed the fact that land was in the hands of a very few, and actually fueled the cries for land reform and for radical redistribution of land. So spool forward to today, and are we really in any different situation? We've had a land registry in this country, the official body for registering land in England and Wales since 1862. But in fact, it still hasn't completed its job of registering all the land. It's still only about 83, perhaps at best 85% complete currently. So there's still a huge chunk of land that's unregistered, whose ownership remains officially unknown, and that we have to guess at who actually owns it. So there's this huge secrecy around land ownership, I think, and this is one of the things that really drew me into wanting to investigate it. And the other thing that really shines a light on how secret land ownership still is the fact that for the stuff that has been registered, all the land and fields and properties that have been registered with the Land Registry, you still have to pay £3 for every land title. And that may not sound like much, but when you realise that there are 24 million land titles that have been registered, and you do the maths, and it turns out that this is the £72 million question of finding out who owns England and indeed Wales, that it's incredibly difficult, therefore, to get a handle on this from the official government body. So I didn't have £72 million to hand when I started setting out investigating who owns England. So I had to go through different methods, and I'll talk about a little bit about some of those different methods of investigation throughout the slideshow. But I just wanted to flick forward now, because we talked about how many people owned England or half of England in the mid-Victorian period. Well, not a vast amount appears to have changed, because by my best estimate and various statistical ways of looking at this issue, less than 1% of the population own half of all England still today. And that is a really startling level of inequality, I think. And part of the reason why I think land ownership remains a big secret is to do with that concentration of wealth and power, and the desire of wealth and power to conceal what's going on as a way of helping to preserve ongoing wealth and power. Because the fewer people looking at what's going on, the less scrutiny it gets, the less likely you are to have to lose that position of influence and status within society as a landowner. Just to flick onto the next slide. When we start to break this down, we start to see how concentrated, even within this 1% we're talking about here, land ownership has remained unchanged in many respects for centuries. We can see here that actually, by my best estimates, a huge amount of the land in England remains in the hands of the aristocracy and gentry, about 30% or so. Contrast that to the amount of land that's owned by homeowners. Only about 5% comprises homes and gardens in England, and that's coming from everything from the National Ecosystem Assessment through to ONS data. And you can see that when we sometimes hear from politicians that we're a property-owning democracy, or indeed when you hear from some conservationists that we're worried about everything being concreted over, clearly there are issues with urban development, urban sprawl. If we were to build houses everywhere, into the countryside, even more than they currently are, then we would be doing more to damage nature, and there would be a cost to that. But I think we need to really understand better how land is carved up in the UK and in England, and to get a better grasp, a greater land literacy, I think, about how it's divided up, both in terms of its use and in terms of its ownership. Because as we can see, the amount of land that's owned by a few thousand members of the aristocracy and landed gentry vastly outweighs all of the land that's owned by homeowners. And some of the other bars in this bar chart here, we can see land owned by corporations. Obviously, that's developed quite a lot since the Victorian period, since the last doomsday was done. Oligarchs and city bankers and new money own a huge amount of land as well. Some of that has replaced aristocratic estates as they've declined, but still holding strong there as well. And another striking thing that I think this bar chart reveals is the sheer amount of land that's actually owned by the public sector, and how small that is compared to everything else, and also how much that's declined over time. A lot of that land, a lot of the land that the public sector owned in its heyday of sort of post-World War II through to the 1970s has been sold off in the last 40 years through periods of privatisation under Margaret Thatcher, through to austerity under David Cameron and since. To give you just a bit more of a sense of what the concentration of land ownership can mean on a local level, I wanted to show you one example of a land ownership map that I made. And this is showing you who owns large part of the county that I felt lucky enough to grow up in. It was a very leafy county. I knew it was quite wealthy when I was growing up there. It was a very beautiful bit of the countryside, West Berkshire. It was also a scene of environmental protest and other protests whilst I was growing up. Greenham Common was a big battle in the 1980s over land owned by the Ministry of Defence and leased out to the US Air Force for the sighting of cruise missiles. That was a big battle over land and access to an old, what had previously been a common. But also there were environmental protests going on whilst I was growing up there in the 1990s with the Newbury bypass, when Swampy was getting his claim to fame and going down tunnels and then appearing on Have I Got News for You. But what I didn't really realise when I was growing up there was quite how wealthy some of the inhabitants of West Berkshire were and how much land they owned. And so each of the colours on this map you can see is our estates. You can see that they're hugely concentrated, hugely in terms of ownership structure. In fact, the large blue estate on the right-hand side of the map here is actually the Englefield estate, which is owned by the recently former MP for the area, Richard Bennion. So you get a sense there, I think, of how wealth and power, land ownership still to this day are intertwined. That the largest lord of the manor, as it were, in West Berkshire became its MP in recent times. And I think this is a pattern that's repeated across the country. The source of information for this set of maps didn't come directly from the Land Registry. It would have cost a huge amount of money to get all that information out of the Land Registry, but it came from another source, a source called the Highways Act maps. And these are lodged by landowners when they wish to defend their land against public rights of way claims. So in some ways, their landowners are hoisted by their own petard by this, because actually they have inadvertently revealed the existence of their estates and how big they are, and the fact that they are trying to deter future rights of way from being put through their estates. But it's only if you are as geeky as I am and get into this in a big way and start to look around, poke around the back end of local authority websites, do you start to find these maps. Most local authorities have them. They take a lot to kind of extract them and get the data out of them and start to kind of make them more accessible. But this sort of information is partly how I started investigating land ownership and started to start to shine a light on some of this hidden information. Static maps are all well and good, but if you really want to dig into this, I think you have to really look at some of the interactive data on this. And this is a map that I did the investigations for, but was built by a fantastic coder and data journalist, Anna Powell-Smith, and it's available at this URL, map.whowownsengland.org. So please do have a play around with that if you haven't seen it before and want to investigate it. You can zoom in, you can see and click on each of the shapes, each of the polygons, as they're called, to find out more about different landowners. You can see in this sort of snapshot here of southern England, particularly standing out there is Salisbury Plain, coloured in black, owned by the Ministry of Defence, not so far from Bath, but also areas owned by the Crown Estate, coloured in purple, or that sort of rash of land owned in red, coloured in red, which is land owned by offshore and overseas companies, which is something that has particularly become, I guess, an issue in the last 20 or 30 years, and was something that Anna, along with a very brilliant journalist at Private Eye, Christian Eriksen, investigated, and was one of the reasons why I also started to investigate this and got interested in the issue as well in the first place. So you might be thinking by now, okay, land ownership is unequal, the world is unfair. why does this really matter to us, particularly today? Isn't this all a kind of an interesting history that England remains a very conservative country and a very unequal country? Well, I would argue that there is an additional set of reasons to care about land ownership in the 21st century, and that relates to the climate emergency and indeed the interrelated ecological emergency affecting nature and biodiversity. And that's because land is obviously fundamental to the climate crisis. We often are perhaps more accustomed to thinking of the climate crisis as being a crisis of energy and fossil fuel use, but equally it's about imbalance between sources and sinks of emissions. So if we're to actually start tackling the climate emergency seriously, if we're to get to net zero, as the government has committed us to doing by 2050 in this country, we can't just get emissions down to zero as quickly as possible, although that's absolutely essential. We also have to remove some of the pollution that we've put into the atmosphere already. And one of the safest ways of doing that, I would argue, is to make better use of our land, rather than relying on unproven technologies like carbon capture and storage, and indeed things that could be potentially very damaging to the ecosystem by further intensifying things like bioenergy crops. We ought to be working better with natural carbon sinks, things like trees and peat and other things which we'll talk about in a minute. But I think to be able to get a handle on that and to increase the usage of natural climate solutions, we have to really tackle land ownership and get to grips with it, because who owns land gets to decide a huge amount how it's used. One of the ways in which land is currently used that's hugely detrimental to climate change is this. This is a picture of moorland burning that still goes on in our uplands in England. In fact, just recently started again on October the 1st, which is the start of the burning season. And we're used to seeing, I think, unfortunately, depressingly used to seeing pictures of wildfires, of vegetation on fire nowadays being caused in places like the Amazon, or indeed in Australia or in California. And this, you know, as the world warms, we're going to see yet more of this going on. But this is an instance of us deliberately setting fire to an ecosystem. It's being done right now under our very noses in parts of England that perhaps not many people are aware of. And it's a Victorian anachronism in the 21st century in a warming world. And the reason this is done is essentially for the benefit of around 150 grouse moor estates that own an area of land the size of Greater London, sorry. And that's just in England. There's even more of them in Scotland. They do this to manage them as grouse moors for the benefit of shooting. And they set fire to the heather at this time of year in order to create a food source for young grouse chicks to be able to eat and to maximize their numbers so that they can shoot them when it comes around to August the 12th, which is the so-called glorious 12th, the start of the shooting season. And this is done essentially to create a monoculture, a habitat that is managed entirely for the maximization of shooting, of a sport, maximizing the bag of game birds, as it's called. And if we look at where grouse moors are found, they are actually found on areas where most soil carbon is found in England. And this map shows you is a soil carbon map generated by CEH and Cranfield University. And the darker the red, the more soil carbon there is. And we can see here that there's a lot of soil carbon stored in the uplands, the Pennines, the Peak District, the Lake District, and the North York Moors. Not to mention what's going on in Wales there as well, and obviously in the lowland fens country as well. But focusing here on the upland peat, these are all peat bogs, but they are also where we found our grouse moors. So essentially, this map shows you the location of the grouse moors. We'll just flip back and forwards between the two slides. We can see there's a very good match. So essentially, what that means is that 150 people, grouse moor owners, own our largest carbon store, which is pretty staggering, and another way of thinking about the concentration of power and wealth and influence, I think, in this country, because they also ultimately have a huge say over our future, the future of our climate, the future of these areas as ecosystems and what we do with them. And whilst they remain grouse moors, and particularly grouse moors that are intended to be used in a way that maximises the number of grouse that can be shot, essentially seeing this as a kind of form of canned shooting, as Benedict MacDonald, the conservationist who wrote a book called Rewilding, calls it. Not a kind of traditional form of shooting or hunting that puts emphasis on skill, but actually one that simply puts emphasis on the ease of being able to shoot the maximum number of birds. I don't see there being any real major change to this. Essentially, we have to bring an end to this pattern of ownership, and certainly this pattern of shooting, and very much this pattern of land management, if we're to see any different future for our uplands and for our largest carbon store. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about how land ownership interacts with our national parks. So many of our national parks in England are also found in our uplands. This shows you the ownership of the North York Moors National Park. And unlike in the US and in many other countries, our national parks are not owned by the nation or for the nation. They are, the vast majority of them are in private ownership still. You think of US national parks like Yosemite and Yellowstone as being very large federal reserves. It's not the case in the UK. Our national park authorities do own some land within each of their jurisdictions, but it's a tiny percentage in each. And here we can see the fact that actually it's a very small number of private landowners who own the vast majority of the upland areas of this national park. It's about 15 to 20 landowners. There's an earl or two, a duke or two, the Duchy of Lancaster, the Queen, in other words, 2 viscounts, and the bloke who set up Carphone Warehouse and who incidentally fixed Boris Johnson's holiday for him in Mustique over last Christmas, a man called David Ross, who owns the Rosedale and Westerdale moors in the centre of this map here. Again, why does this matter? Well, I think it matters because these are our national parks, and in the end, we have to have a say, I think, ultimately over how these parks and these areas of land are managed and owned for the nation. At the moment, national park authorities have very little say, really, over how these areas of land are managed. They do have some control as a planning authority over the built environment and what's done in terms of development, rightly, in national parks. But they don't really have very much to be able to say or control about how the vast majority of the land is used. So they don't have control over forestry. We obviously have a large amount of land here owned by the Forestry Commission, but also other private forestry enterprises as well. And they certainly don't have very much sway over how land is used. Moorland is used for grouse moors, for burning, for overgrazing by sheep, and other potentially destructive environmental practices. There was a review recently carried out for the government of national parks and AONBs called the Glover Review, after Julian Glover, its author. And the government have yet to respond to that, but it did make some useful recommendations, I think, although probably not ones that were particularly radical, about how national parks surely have a role to play in the 21st century in tackling the climate crisis. At the moment, their statutory duty does not include any mention of that. Indeed, really what national parks have been set up to do is to manage an area of land that's deemed to be aesthetically pleasing and beautiful. There's absolutely no doubt that many of the landscapes in our national parks are indeed very beautiful, but equally there is much to be desired about how they're being managed for nature. A recent RSPB report looked at how SSIs, sites of special scientific interest, are in a worse state in many of our national parks than they are outside of our national parks, which I think gives you an indication of what a state they are in. I'd like to move on to talk about trees, because trees are one way I think which we should be increasing the carbon storage in our biosphere, in our ecosystems in the UK and in England. Peat is absolutely essential. It contains a huge amount of carbon already, and if we were to get it back into a healthy functioning state, it would start to sequester more carbon again. But at the moment, it's currently emitting about 23 megatons of CO2 every year. Trees have a really important role to play in already drawing down carbon, and I think by increasing area, the area of woodland in England and in the UK, they can do a lot more. And something I've been doing with Friends of the Earth in our campaign to double tree cover has been looking at mapping where it's possible to establish new woodlands and do so in a way that is clearly putting the right tree in the right place, or indeed allowing nature to do that job for us by naturally regenerating woodlands and scrub. And so this is give you a bit more information about some of the campaign I've been working on at Friends of the Earth. One of the things we've been trying to do is work to persuade and cajole lots of landowners who own large amounts of land, who own potentially suitable land for planting or growing more trees, to be more active in doing so. So we've been talking to and trying to pressure everyone from councils and farmers through to water companies and the Church of England. And one thing in particular we've been doing is looking at the top 10 institutional landowners in England. This shows you what they own. This is the list of the top 10 institutional landowners, starting with the Forestry Commission, National Trust, MOD, the Crown Estate, United Utilities, one of the largest water companies, Highways England and Network Rail, who obviously most of the land is given over to roads and railways, but also own actually a lot of other land as well around the side of roads and railways, where actually could be potentially good for having trees on to be able to buffer against noise and so on as well, and pollution. RSPB, the Duchy of Cornwall, the Princess of Wales's estate, and the Church Commissioners. But something that we found, so working with a very brilliant PhD student, Tim Harris, who is working at the Natural History Museum currently, he took this landowner data set for us and intersected it with the National Forest Inventory. And we were able to then look to see what that meant in terms of woodland cover for each of these top 10 landowners. And next slide shows you our landowner league table by woodland cover, ranked by percentage of woodland on the land owned by these top 10 landowners. And obviously, unsurprisingly, the Forestry Commission is at the top. This isn't a commentary on the quality of that woodland. A lot of obviously the Forestry Commission's trees and will be plantations of dubious potential biodiversity benefit, although undoubtedly locking up quite a lot of carbon. But in terms of sheer overall area, you can see here the percentage of woodland on each of these landowners' estates, with the Duchy of Cornwall surprisingly second from bottom, despite everything that Prince Charles often has said about planting trees, and right at the very bottom, the Church Commissioners, the pension fund, essentially the financial investment arm of the Church of England. And I think we were quite surprised, particularly by how low down the Prince of Wales and the Duchy of Cornwall were in this, but also particularly shocked by how little the Church Commissioners appear to have done in terms of growing trees on their land. Not least because the Church of England has, as part of its kind of mandate, its mission, its stated mission is the preservation and restoration of creation. And indeed, they've recently signed up via General Synod to a target to get to net zero by 2030. So clearly, carbon sinks are going to be a crucial part of this, and natural climate solutions are a really important part of how the Church and other organisations can contribute towards getting to net zero. And we thought this was something we wanted to try and do, was to start to kind of shine a light on how landowners could and should be made, particularly large landowners could and should be made responsible for doing more to help tackle the climate and ecological crises. It's something where we've seen the success of the divestment campaign in putting pressure on large pension funds for their investments in fossil fuels and pressuring them into divest from fossil fuel investments. But we feel that something that could be done more in future is to start to turn also to large landowners and to start to scrutinise more in the way of what they are doing with their estates. After all, in the end, it's kind of a bit of a zero-sum game. If you own a large chunk of England and you've decided that you want to do X, Y, Z with your estate, you want to burn it for grouse moors or overgraze it with sheep, it's kind of preventing that land from being it's getting to its full potential as a carbon sink, or indeed as a thriving ecosystem. So I think there's a huge responsibility that large landowners have in terms of helping tackle the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis that we face. And hopefully this is something that more organisations, more activists will jump onto in the future and start to get interested in what their local landowners are doing and what the large landowners are doing with huge amounts of land that they control. Now, I mentioned in the blurb for this talk that I would talk about pheasants. So I can't avoid talking about pheasants. This is another issue to do with land and land ownership. There are huge numbers of pheasants introduced into the countryside every year. We might think of them as very harmless. Indeed, in many respects they are. They just run around committing suicide in front of cars as they run out in front of cars at an absolute rate of knots. But there are so many of them introduced into the English countryside nowadays by gamekeepers, by estates that want to shoot them, that they are starting to have an ecological impact through sheer weight of numbers. In fact, I think the latest figures are around 50 million pheasants are introduced every year in the UK. And for a non-native bird species, it's quite staggering how little has to be done in terms of having any licenses. If you're a landowner and you want to introduce pheasants on a huge scale, you only have to register the fact that you own them and the numbers that you own. And this was my attempt here to try and use some of that data from the Animal and Plant Health Authority to find out where the largest concentrations of pheasant releases are in the country, released pheasant ownership is. And in fact, one of these postcode districts in Yorkshire has over 1 million pheasants registered in it. So you can start to get a sense of how many there must be running around in that part of the country and having an impact on everything from adders. There was an interesting story the other day about how pheasants and game bird releases are contributing to the decline of adders because they predate upon them, through to just simply the structure of ecosystems, the structure of woodlands and hedgerows. And there's research that's been done by the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, many of whose members are indeed pheasant estates, but they have done research showing how this at high densities of release, pheasants can start to have a negative ecological impact on the countryside. There's an interesting legal case that campaigners Wild Justice, that's Chris Packer, Mark Avery, and Ruth Tingay, has recently launched, and I think they've got a judicial review coming up for a hearing in early November, challenging the government to do an environmental impact assessment on the environmental impacts of this sheer amount of pheasants that landowners release into the countryside. And hopefully they'll be successful in getting the government to have to do one, because clearly things have got to a pretty bizarre state of affairs where you can release 50 million pheasants without an EIA, or indeed without licenses, and yet to be able to reintroduce beavers to this country, a native species that were wiped out by people 400 years ago. The amount of paperwork you have to do to be able to reintroduce those is enormous. So something has got badly out of kilter in the way in which we treat our land and the mix of species that we allow to thrive in it. I wanted to turn now to talking about rewilding. Rewilding is something that has obviously become rightly, I think, very much on everyone's tip of everyone's tongues recently. It's become a very popular idea thanks to books like George Monbiot's Feral and Isabella Tree's book Wilding. And this picture is of the Knepp estate, which is owned by Isabella Tree and Charlie Burrell, a 3,000 acre estate that I had the pleasure of being able to visit earlier this year when lockdown restrictions were slightly eased. And it's an amazing example of actually how there are some fantastic work being done by large landowners, but unfortunately I think they are some of the exceptions to the rule rather than the rule itself. But what they've done at the Knepp estate is absolutely miraculous. They've allowed scrub to return, they've allowed trees to naturally regenerate, they've reintroduced wild species, but also domesticated animals that start to mimic the processes that we had in this country, but have since kind of wiped out species that have formed those roles in those ecological niches. And what they've seen over the last 20 years is a huge return of wildlife to their estate, and it's something that's absolutely amazing and fantastic to see. There are other landowners in places like the Cairngorms in Scotland, where some very large sporting estates there have started to control the kind of rampant deer numbers that they've seen in recent years, and that's allowing more trees to return, allowing rivers to be rewiggled and rewilded in themselves as well. So I suppose, to be honest, this raises a question, and something that I've seen raised by rewilders, which is that actually large estates can be a good thing from the point of view of nature, because they clearly allow for very large refuges to be for nature to be established. They allow the creation of nature reserves at considerable scale. You just simply can't get the sort of joining up of ecological networks and the restoration of some of these keystone species if you were to only do conservation on a small scale, on very small sites. And there's absolutely a lot of truth to that. A lot of the sites that are being looked at by Rewilding Britain, which is an organisation that got founded out of the back of George Monbiot's book on rewilding. A lot of the estates that they're working with are very large estates. They're aristocrats and others who have decided to return some of their lands to the wild, or to at least form nature-friendly forms of farming. But I think probably what we can also see from some of the earlier slides that I showed is that, again, these few pioneer landowners remain the exception rather than the rule at this stage. And there are many other landowners who are doing the opposite of rewilding, who are indeed causing, I would say, disasters like the Saddleworth moor fire that we saw back in 2018 that took place on a grouse moor during a very hot summer, but on land that had been mismanaged, that had been desiccated and dried out and had become a tinderbox. So whilst we have some amazing examples of landowners doing the right thing, we also have the broader picture where landowners and the pattern of land ownership is starkly tilted against nature from recovering. And I don't think in the end that we can hope to rely simply on the goodwill of a few enlightened landowners when faced with the urgency of the climate and ecological emergencies. We need landscape scale changes. And I think part of that is about bringing greater pressure to bear and greater scrutiny to bear on landowners as a whole. So really, to wrap up and to conclude the slides I have, and before we go into more of a discussion, I think we need to do much more in England and the rest of the UK to pressure landowners into acting on climate change and the ecological emergency. We need to rediscover an interest as a country in land and how it's used and who owns it. We need nature recovery networks that integrate with the planning system to help guide future areas for nature recovery. But in order to create viable ecological networks, we're going to have to contend with the existing patterns of land ownership, or bring about some degree of land reform and start to increase the amount of land in community ownership, for example. There's a fantastic example of a community that's currently banding together to try to buy up a former grouse moor estate on the borders, in the Scottish borders, called the Langholm Moor Community Buyout. And they're making use of laws that Scotland enjoys, but we don't have in England and Wales, a strengthened power of community purchase and access to recourse to some public funding. But even that community who are doing so well at raising money are finding it incredibly hard to contend with the hugely high land values that are still attached to sporting estates, such as the one they're trying to purchase. They have to raise £6 million. I think they've got about £3 million of it raised so far, but there's about a month to go. So they're really desperate to try and get more money to be able to purchase that estate and rewild it. In the absence of a strengthening of community right to buy powers in England, or indeed a reduction in land values so that it makes it more viable for everyone to get involved with, I think we do have to contend with some of the existing patterns of land ownership. But I think we absolutely have to create greater transparency about who owns land and increase the amount of scrutiny on landowners and their responsibilities to manage land in the right way for all of us. because ultimately this is our land too. I think you might be on mute.
Thank you very much indeed, guys. Sorry, I was just coming off mute there. That was a really fascinating lecture. Thanks so much indeed. Well, and we've got a number of questions from our audience that are coming in, and I'll start them. I'll kick them off if I may, just by this question that you touched on there towards the end on the sort of balance between seeking changes in land ownership, deconcentration of land ownership, and increasing community or public ownership of land, versus other measures to regulate existing owners and to change what they do with their land. I mean, given what you say about the sort of persistence of forms of land ownership and tenure over many centuries, where should the balance lie there? I mean, if you stress the reform of ownership, do you find yourself then operating just at the margins? And if so, do you need a kind of radical strategy? Or do you think actually, look, you know, the most important thing to do is just to, as we're doing with the rest of the economy, if you like, for trying to adjust, particularly for climate change, is to regulate and impose new forms of activity on existing owners?
Yes, I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think some people sometimes are disappointed that I'm not kind of calling for a kind of full pitchforks revolution and that we should all go and seize land from the great aristocrats and bring it back into peasant ownership or the commons or whatever. I mean, I think unfortunately, Gerald Winstanley and the Diggers, who are a fantastic, inspirational bunch of revolutionaries during the English Civil War, tried to do just that. And even during the upheaval of the Civil War, after we cut the head off the king and everything was potentially the world was being turned upside down, even they were unable to do so at such a time of ferment. And I think probably that's not going to be the right strategy going forward right now. But I think that actually land reform is perhaps in the 21st century is perhaps more subtle, but I think more interesting than simply about changing who owns the land. I think it is about land ownership is about a bundle of property rights, ultimately. The right to exclude others, for example, as well as own land is an interesting question. It's seen as a kind of inalienable part of property rights of land ownership in England, but actually we do now have the right to roam over some parts of the country. So that's a way in which we've started to change the nexus of property rights there, and said that actually more people should be allowed to have access to land even if they don't own it. And I think when it comes to things like climate change and the ecological emergency, we've got so little time. We have to move incredibly rapidly to get these transformational changes. I do absolutely think there should be an increase in the community ownership of land. I think we should be following what Scotland has been doing in the last 20 years and increasing community ownership of land through things like community right to buy. And I think that could be beneficial for wildlife and for the climate crisis, if that led to greater kind of rewilding by communities, or indeed greater control of watersheds, such as, you know, if people in Hebden Bridge, which is always being flooded out by the grouse moor that's just upstream from them, if they were able to control that land and that natural watershed as a community asset, I think that would be fantastic, and could be replicated across other places as well. But I do think that we do have to contend with the fact that this is a system of ownership that has existed for the last 1,000 years or thereabouts. And we have to be able to put pressure on existing landowners as well as try and make changes to the pattern of land ownership. So I would say that yes, it's about increasing transparency, increasing scrutiny, more people taking an interest in who owns land and how it's being used, and, you know, doing things like learning from the divestment movement, who put so much excellent pressure on pension funds and other large investors, to be able to kind of apply that now to landowners as the kind of next frontier, I think, in the climate fight.
Great. Well, we've got lots of questions coming in. One was first one was when you expose these sort of top 10 institutional landowners for having such little woodland. I mean, what kind of response did you get from them? And that's one question. And the other is, you know, are there just ways of moving? Well, there's a set of questions around farming, really. Where do farmers sit in your ownership patterns? And isn't it more appropriate to think about regenerative farming practices than planting trees? And you know, where do tenant farmers generally sit in these dynamics of land ownership and management? So perhaps you could say a bit about those questions, Guy?
Yes, sure. I should have probably written down the first of those. Sorry, but
Well,
farmers.
first one was just what response did you get from the top 10
Oh
institutes?
yes, yes. We've had a very polite response from the Duchy of Cornwall, as you would expect from Prince Charles and his office. But I understand that they're carrying out kind of more of a kind of an assessment in the round of the ecosystems on their estate, which is commendable. But I mean, I think we'll be interested to see if they will be doing more to change that in future in terms of in trying to restore more nature and increase the amount of woodland cover and other habitats. From the church commissioners, I have to say they are they're a very secretive organisation. They have been for very many centuries, or at least their predecessors were as well. And I think they are. I think others would also rightly criticise them for being very focused on the bottom line when it comes to they are ultimately of course they are the pension fund for the Church of England essentially, and so they obviously have a fiduciary duty to their to the clergy and to the pension holders. But I do think they also have certain moral duties as well as sort of duties to the rest of us in terms of the huge amount of land they own. So I think I would like to see, hopefully they will see more engagement from them in the future. I think in terms of farmers, yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, certainly I talked about trees and peat, but obviously missing out huge amounts of other ways in which land is used. And certainly there's a huge role that nature-friendly farming and regenerative agriculture has to play, agroecology, whatever you wish to call it. These sorts of different techniques are incredibly important. But also this is about agroforestry, I think. Agroforestry being a really important way of starting to kind of blur the boundaries as there always used to be between farming and forestry. They've each developed into quite destructive monocultures in many respects. But if you look at how farming used to be, if you read what the great author Oliver Rackham writes about woodland management in previous centuries, that used to be the proper management of woodland, whether that's as hedgerows or copses or coppicing, used to be much more part of every farm. And I think that's sort of, if we can get back to something like that, or rather forward to something like that in the future, supported by new systems of farm subsidy like the environmental land management system that's coming in post-Brexit, then I think that would be a very good outcome. In terms of land ownership by farmers, yes, I perhaps slightly glossed over that in the bar graph I showed earlier, but a lot of farmers are tenants, and so they will ultimately be tenanting from some of the larger estates, whether that's the old aristocratic estates or some of the newer money. Some farms are obviously very large agribusinesses and would come under the kind of the corporate kind of category in that typology. So I think, yeah, they're sort of covered largely there, but there's an interesting set of statistics I had to rely on to be able to try and get a sense of how concentrated land ownership is in England. And it's the farm data that DEFRA publish each June. So if anyone's interested in looking at in greater detail at the breakdown of land ownership within sort of farming sector, then you can look at that and start to see that actually still, even within that, a very large number of farms are nowadays, really quite large. A large amount of land is locked up in large farms.
Thanks, Chris. So obviously your book and your lecture, had some really good examples of the of data research and data journalism for sort of investigating and bring to light these issues and being able to campaign on them. But you said at the beginning, and there's a question from James Copestake here, that there's very high cost of accessing the registry, the National Registry, and what could be done to promote greater freedom of information and data access for the public. And related to that, another question from Liam McLeese, asking, what do you know about the private and offshore owners? Are there any other ways of getting into more detail about the corporate, private and offshore owners?
Well, actually, if I take that one first, because actually to give them some credit, the Land Registry have started to open up over the last few years. One of the first things that happened, and I think Private Eye can take a lot of credit for doing this, is that the Land Registry now do publish data regularly on offshore and overseas landowners. And you can download that from the Land Registry's website. You just have to register there as a user of the website, and you can download it all. What you can't do is download the maps. The maps are still kind of more difficult to get a handle on, owing to some various restrictive licenses that have also recently changed. But also just the fact that the Land Registry and Ordnance Survey have artificially divided the maps from the actual information on ownership, which is I think really rather silly and really needs to be corrected. But to be able to answer the first question, I mean, fundamentally it's very simple. The Land Registry needs to be opened up. There's a great model for this. It's Companies House. Companies House until a few years ago was a demanded fees to be able to look at company records in response to pressure from everyone, including dataless journalists who said this is not very helpful to be able to hold corrupt companies to account or to be able to scrutinise what's going on. They opened it up, they dropped the fees, and everything's been free at a point of access for some years now. Exactly the same model could be used with the Land Registry, and I think actually a lot of the experience of open data campaigners has been to find that actually the overall benefits to the economy of opening up more of this data is vastly greater than trying to just simply charge a few geeks like myself at point of entry to find out what's going on in there. So I think really you would start to see a lot more being built off the back of this sort of information. You'd start to see, I think, a lot more useful stuff being done around the planning system as well, because people could start to see who is lobbying who at the local level in terms of planning as well.
Great. I think you've answered quite a few of the questions there actually as well. But there are a couple about the sort of post-Brexit regime for subsidy for, I'm going to put it in those terms, for the sort of public goods in land ownership. Can you say a little bit about what you think some of the kinds of results of that might be of this sort of new means of payments to farmers and landowners for what happens with their land? And I suppose there's a question from well, it's actually a couple more come in. One from somebody saying, what does it actually mean in terms of assistance and subsidies, that if you wanted to buy a small holding or buy a small farm, rewilding, you mentioned rewilding being better for sort of larger areas, but for people that want to sort of take action, what will this new regime mean, and how much do you need to kind of make a change even at a small level?
I mean, in terms of the subsidies question, I mean, up until now, the vast bulk of farm payments are paid out under a sort of basic payment scheme, which essentially rewards the landowner or the farmer for the amount of land that they own and manage. It's very crude, really. There's very few strings attached. Some basic means of cross-compliance and things basically saying, please don't destroy birds' nests, and other stuff which is kind of fairly basic. But really, it's a kind of largely no strings attached subsidy for the area of land that you own and manage. That, thankfully, is being reformed. It could have been reformed through the EU in years gone by. We're deciding now to reform it because we're leaving through Brexit. I think it's one of the small silver linings to Brexit. It still is hanging in the balance. The agriculture bill has been only just going through Parliament still, and the details of the schemes that are to replace the old system are yet to be worked out in large detail. What we've been promised from multiple environment secretaries now, from Michael Gove onwards through to George Eustace, who's the current environment secretary, is that we will see a system of public money for public goods. And what that is meant to mean is that public goods such as the environment, which are not usually paid for at point of sale of food, do get extra subsidies. It would be wrong to, I think, continue to subsidise food per se, because we already pay for it, and the environment doesn't get enough money anyway. So I think things like natural flood defences, trees, grassland restoration, peatland restoration, all these sorts of things ought to be being better subsidised under the new system. But as I say, the details are yet to be worked out, and of course there will be ongoing lobbying by landowners, I'm sure, to continue to get money for fewer strings and for fewer regulations in return. I mean, when it comes to kind of rewilding, I think everyone can do that, can help, maybe not to kind of the extent of, kind of the scale of rewilding that's going on in the Glenfeshie estate in Scotland or Knepp in Sussex, but if it's about bringing back a small amount of untidiness to someone's garden, that's helpful in itself. I think something that we've been beset by in recent decades is ecological tidiness syndrome, which has meant that we kind of equate tidying up every last corner with a kind of idea of a beautiful garden, but actually just having more mess, more dynamism in our green spaces, more places for habitats for wildlife to live in, but also restoring kind of the sense that actually the wild, a proper functioning ecosystem is a dynamic system. It's not just static. It's not just preserved in aspic. That's why things like beavers being reintroduced to the corners of rivers and fields in farmers' fields is fantastic, because I think it's showing more and more people how actually the ecosystem needs to be changed. It needs to have it needs to be messy. It needs to have things going on in it where creatures like beavers are starting to re-engineer habitats in new and exciting ways. And we won't know all the outcomes of that. It will throw up lots of new and exciting things we don't yet know.
A couple of questions are coming on, that perennial hardy of debating this area is land value tax. Obviously a long-standing goal of land reform advocates, but actually more broadly, I think now widely held that you can't avoid tax on land because you can't move land, and often the possession of land does little to encourage investment, and actually landowners, whether in cities or in the countryside, are effectively rent extracting. I mean, do you see in trying to help deal with some of these issues about ownership and land use that a land value tax could play a role? And if you do, how do you overcome this problem that there have been advocates for a land value tax for a long time, but very little political support for such a move, or at least that's materialized into real change?
I think that's it, isn't it? I mean, land value tax obviously does make a lot of sense. It is economically efficient. It is absolutely, it would be a just tax. It would be absolutely right to introduce one. But it has always suffered from this problem of no matter how many detailed exposés and pamphlets and books by Henry George and revised books on Henry George are issued, it doesn't necessarily get political traction. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we do obviously have a very large number of relatively speaking, a large number of homeowners in the UK nowadays, and compared to the time when Henry George was writing about a land value tax. And so that has created a political or an electoral block against, not just against a land value tax, but against even something as basic as revaluing council tax, which hasn't been revalued since 1991. To be able to make even council tax anywhere closer to the value of properties and a fairer tax is very difficult. But there are people trying to push for that and to reframe some of this debate, which I think is really good. I think another way in which we could get closer to a land value tax, and one in fact that seems to be being considered even by the current Treasury, is to at least introduce it on commercial properties. Now, COVID has, I think, thrown everything up in the air about what it means for the high street, what it means for the geography of our towns. So I think that has to be, land value tax on commercial properties has to be considered in the light of that, and of course the rise of things like of Amazon and online shopping and so on. But I think if we wanted to start to get towards a land value tax, commercial land value tax, before trying to deal with the thorny issues of a residential land value tax is essential. But equally, another way forward could be to look at things like actually reviving some of the betterment levies that were part of the planning system when it was first introduced in 1947. There's talk now through the planning reforms, most of which could be absolutely disastrous from a point of view of democracy. But in terms of thinking about how much you capture more land, more of the uplift in development for the community, if there are moves afoot by Robert Jenrick and others to try and increase that, then that would be good. I have to say, I don't have a huge amount of faith that they'll do it, but we need to push them.
Absolutely. So question, Guy, from Peter Harper here, and reflects, I think, some of the concerns in other questions that, and you've touched on this in your talk, is that, you know, rewilding, planting trees, other uses of land don't produce food, and food production as a consequence would need to be intensified if we wanted to use our land differently for those goals. So, you know, is that the inevitable consequence of this, that we have less livestock, that we have much more intensive farming, that we have, you know, or that we move to a much more vegetarian or even vegan diet where we're not actually using livestock on our land?
I think that the latter is the key here, and I think that we often think of land use as being, how do we meet the current set of demands with a finite quantity of land. We obviously can't change very much about the current area of land in the UK. It's pretty fixed. They aren't making it anymore, and obviously, if we were to simply rewild the UK and turn it into a lovely nature reserve, but kept on eating as much meat and dairy and avocados and everything else that we eat currently, then we'd be importing even more food and exporting the problem and the destruction. So I think the key is to start to dial down aspects of wasteful demand, and to, you know, to eat less but better meat and dairy, to do what indeed our government health guidelines already tell us, which is to eat less but better meat and dairy. Even just doing that would start to free up more land in the UK and around the world for nature, and you know, that's, I think, a sensible place to start.
I mean, that also raises questions about how you get consumers to change their behaviour. So one issue is about, you know, what we eat and what we consume. And another question we had was, well, if grouse shooting is such a problem, what can you do to influence people that go grouse shooting? I mean, why is it that people want to engage in this activity that is apparently so harmful, and what can be done about it? Is there pressure that can be brought to bear on not just people who own the land, but also those who consume it in these sorts of ways?
Well, I think grouse shooting is just, I love talking about it because it's a really great example of I think a very wasteful use of land for the benefit of a very small number of people. I could also talk about golf courses, but I'd probably offend slightly more people. I think there are, you know, there's discussion about golf courses and access to green space in urban areas particularly. But maybe let's not talk about that. Very, very briefly on the actual question here of how do you influence those small number of people. I wouldn't actually try and influence them necessarily. I would now go back to government and say, you've promised already multiple times to ban one particularly destructive aspect of how this land is used, which is moorland burning. And Zach Goldsmith, Lord Goldsmith, as the Environment Minister, has stood up in Parliament many times now and said we should ban moorland burning. And I think this is a crucial part of the issue, because ultimately it's moorland burning that allows the landscape to be so intensively managed, and it's what really underpins some of the scale of the shooting that goes on, because of the scale of the population of grouse that is maintained as a result of that. So I wouldn't try necessarily to say please don't shoot quite as much. I'm somewhat agnostic on this. Others may disagree, but I think that it would be possible to have a much more ecologically conscious hunting fraternity in this country, one that was perhaps modelled more on what goes on in Scandinavia, where they have much wilder landscapes, many more trees, much more wilder uplands than we do here. But they just don't have the kind of easy canned shooting that we do here. And I think one way to do that is just to get the government to do what it said it's going to do.
Question here from Nick Glass asking what can local councils and in particular also parish councils who want to move this agenda forward can do? What sort of good practice if you're a councillor, or if you're, you know, wanting to work with your local parish or local authority?
Yeah, well, I mean, councils own a huge amount of land as well. I mean, councils in England own about 1.3 million acres of land. A lot of that obviously will be already built on, or may not be suitable for using in any other way than it currently is. But I know for a fact that a lot of it is also farmland, or is woodland, or nature reserves, and there's lots that could be done to either protect that better or improve it and restore it. and to use it in different ways that is better for the planet. And so I think one of the first things that a council or indeed anyone wanting to influence the council should do is talk to the council about the assets they own, is to look at the published asset register that every council is meant to publish, is to request a map of the land and to start to get a handle on what might be done with that land. Councils in the last decade or so have come under particular pressure thanks to austerity to sell off assets. I think that's a mistake often, particularly when it comes to things like county farms, which are being sold off at a rate of knots. They're a vital way for farmers to new incomers to the farming sector to get a rung on the farming ladder, so to speak, to introduce fresh blood into farming, and also for potentially increasing the kind of area of land being used in a kind of agroecological way. That would be a great way to do more nature-friendly farming, having councils as pioneers, following up on all the great words that came from councils over the last couple of years about declaring climate emergencies. What are they doing now to make good on that, and using land that they own in a way that's better for drawing down carbon, locking it up, and farming in a more nature-friendly way? I think is a absolutely really good thing for them to be doing.
I've just got one final question, Guy, I think, because you've taken a lot of questions and you've answered them really well. But we started with this question of, the balance between regulating and trying to change the activities of existing landowners or changing patterns of ownership. And Jake Zarins asked the question, well, why don't we just nationalise some of the most important land? You talked about national parks not being nationally owned in contrast to federal reserves. Why don't we simply seek to nationalise land instead of, paying farmers or landowners, subsidies for doing different things, just take them into public ownership?
So I would say that I think fundamentally it's about accountability. Land ownership has to be at its root about reforming land ownership has to be about greater accountability, and that could be resolved through greater public ownership of land. At least there's notionally there a democratic control over electing who's in charge or who's managing that land. I don't necessarily think you get that all the time. Certainly the kind of more classic statist model of the 70s or whatever is not necessarily the most responsive form of public ownership or state. I think if you were to increase the amount of community ownership, that might be one way to get more accountable ownership. But I think also it's about just increasing the accountability of whoever is owning land in the end. And whether that's through things like greater transparency, therefore there are more eyes, more people watching what's going on, more league tables, more competition between landowners to do the right thing rather than just avert public attention and do the wrong thing, do the default. An open land registry which reveals all of this. But also, to be honest, more a public that starts asking these questions more and more. And I think, starting to rethink what land ownership actually means. We in the UK and England, we have a very long history of seeing land ownership as absolute, as being an Englishman's home being his castle. And if you own a castle, then it's even more so, particularly if you own a castle with 10,000 acres, you can decide to do whatever you want with it. But I think we've seen a number of challenges to that during the 20th century and the 21st centuries. We saw the planning system evolve, which meant that actually you couldn't necessarily build exactly what you wanted on your land without recourse to some degree of public opinion. And more latterly, we've had a partial right to roam introduced in England and Wales, and a full one in Scotland, which has kind of started to challenge that sense that private property also means the right to exclude others. So I think if we could start to kind of take apart some of these ideas around land ownership being something that's completely absolute, that means you can do whatever you want with it forever, even if that involves destroying the nature on it and destroying something that is ultimately a public good for everyone and for all of the earth, then I think we can start to get to a better sense that actually, perhaps even we might get to feel that land doesn't belong to us, or the earth doesn't belong to us, but actually we start to belong to the earth once again. And if that's a bit too hippie, my apologies, but I do work for Friends of the Earth.
Well, we'll absolutely let you have that one, Guy. Thank you very much indeed. It was a really interesting lecture, really, really great. And, you know, lots of really great answers to the questions there. Thank you for answering those questions so fully and so thoroughly. Thank you everybody at home for watching this. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I've done this evening. And as I said at the beginning, it will be available as a podcast and online as a video shortly. So do keep in touch with that if you want to go back over some of the things that Guy's talked about tonight. And at the Institute for Policy Research, we do have a number of other events coming up in October and November, some of which will be about these kind of questions of farming, land use, food supply and climate change. So if you want to keep in touch with us, please do to see what's coming up. And there are a number on our website, a number of previous lectures we've had on things like rewilding, for example, in this series. So do have a look at that if you wish as well. So thanks very much, everybody, for taking part. Thank you again, Guy, for your time this evening. It's very much appreciated. And thank you again for all of your talk and your Q&A this evening. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.